listening to StreetClothes, the podcast that takes you beyond the four walls of the hospital and into the lives of clinicians who live passionately no matter what happens to spark their hearts. Each week, we dive into the hobbies and side hustles that refuel the clinical spirit, recharge the mind, and remind us all that there's a big, beautiful world out there to keep exploring. StreetClothes, because life happens outside of scrubs.
Welcome back to StreetClothes, where we explore what healthcare professionals do when they hang up their scrubs. And today, we're riding the waves into the world of surfing. That's right, we're going to talk about the art of gliding across water on what's essentially a sleek, floating piece of, well, it might have used to be in wood. Now it's probably fiberglass and who knows what else that we'll learn about in today's episode. Pretty far from the sterile halls of a hospital, wouldn't you say? Now, you might be thinking, isn't surfing just for beach bums and adrenaline junkies? Well, grab your stethoscope and prepare to have the notion wiped out. Surfing has drawn all kinds of people from all kinds of walks of life, including plenty of healthcare professionals looking for the perfect balance to their high-stress careers. So, what is it about surfing that keeps people coming back? For starters, there's something almost meditative about it. When you're out there on the water watching out for the next wave, it's just you, your board, and the ocean. All those patient charts, beeping monitors, and hospital politics, they wash away with each passing wave. It's the ultimate mental reset button. But don't be fooled. Surfing isn't just about chilling out. It's also about an incredible full-body workout. From paddling out, which is basically like doing endless pull-ups, to the core strength that's needed to pop up and balance on your board, surfers develop a functional fitness that serves them well in those long hospital shifts. Who needs a gym when you've got the ocean out there for free, right? What's fascinating about the surfing community is the camaraderie. There's an unspoken bond between surfers and a mutual respect for both each other and the power of the ocean. It's not unlike the bonds that are formed between healthcare workers who understand the unique challenges of their profession. When you spot another surfer in the lineup who works in healthcare, there's an immediate connection. You both understand the value of this escape. Obviously, surfing isn't just a hobby. It's a lifestyle, and for many, it's a form of therapy. It's about finding balance, both literally on the board and figuratively in life. Whether you're catching epic barrels or just paddling out for a sunrise session before you go in for a long shift, the ocean offers a place to process the emotional weight that comes from caring for others. So, to all you listeners out there thinking about giving surfing a try, we say go for it. You might just find that the skills that make you great at patient care, persistence, adaptability, and calm under pressure, might make you a natural on the waves as well. And remember, whether you're reading vital signs or reading the ocean, being present in the moment is key. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's conversation with a healthcare professional who has found his balance riding the waves when he's not saving lives. Because we both have extensive knowledge in the world of surfing. I've watched Moana like 12 times
there you go.
In the last week. So, you know. So for surfboards, just to kind of orient me here, how big is the average surfboard, and how do you figure out what size surfboard to use? Is it like a height thing? Is it a weight thing? Is it a preference thing?
So surfboards come in all shapes and sizes, kind of like bicycles.
And people.
Yeah, for sure. And so when you're getting started in surfing, you get a nice, big, enormous, floaty board. And that way, you don't have to expend a lot of energy just to float. And it's like a beach cruiser bicycle versus like a BMX bicycle. This thing just floats along, and then the wave comes and picks you up and you go. As you get more skilled, then you can get less length on your board because it becomes more maneuverable. So these bigger boards, typical length for a surfboard where that someone's learning on is about 9 feet or so. That's considered a long board. And they have a lot of volume and thickness. And so you just lay down and they float. But a smaller board, like a 6-foot board, has a lot less volume and it sinks. So it's just more challenging. One of the most exhausting parts about surfing is paddling. So you need to get from the beach out to where the waves are breaking. And so if you have this big, long, enormous floaty board, you can paddle out without getting exhausted, especially if you're new. But if you have a little potato chip that's only 6 feet and half of it's underwater or 2/3 of it's underwater, by the time you get out to the waves, you're spent. So
is it cheating to use the jet skis to pull you out? I mean, let's just be real.
But how many times have I wished I had a motor under my board? So it depends, if you're a purist. Well, in reality, if you're in crazy critical waves, then a jet ski is the right move. If you're just
because you're not getting out otherwise, right?
Yeah, able to be rescued also. But if you're just a rich jet ski or a friend who's got a rich friend with a jet ski and he's or she's pulling you around, I don't know, you might make some enemies in the water.
Now, just clarify for me, because I have never surfed in my life. I know nothing of the sport, but the waves don't crash right on the shore. Like you have to go out like quite a ways. And a lot of times the bigger waves and the bigger spots that you go to, like you actually have to be transported to that because they're offshore. The waves actually break farther out.
Right. So essentially what happens is a storm generates wind, and then the wind disturbs the surface of the water. And then that disturbance travels along many miles, ultimately organizing in waves. Just like a marathon has 1,000 runners at the start, and then they all start to group around the same amount of time per mile. So then the 6 milers and the 6 minuters and 5 minuters and so on, they all cluster together. So if you have a storm that's way off the shore and it travels a long distance, the waves have different periods, different wavelengths, and all those different wavelengths waves will group together in clusters and create what's called a wave train, and they'll all arrive on the shore according to how long it is between peak and trough, their wave period. Now, they have to hit something on the bottom to disturb the trough to make it kind of jack up and break. And usually that's just as you approach the shore, the sand gets, or the beach gets shallower and shallower and shallower, and then the ocean turns into the sand. And so that's called the beach break, where the trough of the wave hits the bottom and then the energy gets pushed upward and then the wave breaks. Other times it will be interrupted by a coral reef that's, anywhere off the shore. So if you have a reef, you have a mile, between the reef and the beach. Once the wave hits the reef, it gets interrupted and starts to jack up. And so to answer your question, some of them will break 50 yards offshore, 20 yards offshore, and then some of them will be several miles because there's a certain trench or shallow enough area with something that's sticking up from the bottom that breaks the waves, passage.
Gotcha. So like, I'm thinking like Mavericks, or even where they had the Olympic events where it was like quite a ways offshore because it was getting broken up by a coral reef, right?
Or some underwater structure, usually a reef. Yes.
So what's the craziest thing you've ever seen while surfing? Like we're going to talk about the mechanics of surfing and the waves and everything else, but unrelated to the actual event of surfing, what's the craziest thing that you've seen animal-wise, or just like random thing on the beach-wise or in the sky-wise? Like what's that one thing that sticks out to you?
A humpback whale breached about, 20, 50 yards from where I was. And so where I live, there's a certain section that's broken up by these jetties. And I was in the corner of one section, and then the next jetty over, which is basically like a city block, I just saw something flying out of the water, and then bam, right on its side. And I was, holy crap, that was a whale, like 50 yards from me. So yeah, that was probably the craziest, but I've seen plenty of seals, lots of dolphins, amazing sunrises and sunsets, but that was the craziest thing I've ever seen.
Like with the whale, did that make you feel, I mean, well, yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What did that make you feel? Like, what was that feeling going back to seeing that?
Oh, there's a whole entire world under there that I don't even know about. I mean, I know about, but nonetheless. Yeah.
I mean, for me, that would be terrifying. Like, I would be absolutely like, I'm done. I'm back in the shore. But
sea monster.
Yeah, there was one with a friend of mine, and this school of fish. They looked like manta rays, sort of, but they swam kind of on their sides, so it just looked like a fin. But it looked like a bunch of fins. And I was with buddies, and I was like, because I've seen a dolphin fin, I don't know, hundreds of times, and they have a very distinct non-shark looking fin. But this thing, a bunch of them, and I was, 75 feet away or 75 yards offshore with one of my buddies, and I was like, listen, man, I don't know what these guys are. I got to get out of here right now. And that was, that was the spooky factor. The whale was more like, holy crap, that was enormous. I'm glad it didn't land on me. But the fin situation was, okay, it's time to go now.
So you mentioned your buddy. That was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about on this. Is surfing primarily a solo sport or hobby, or is this something that you can actually do with your friends or your buddies, and it kind of feels like you're doing it together as opposed to just doing it at the same time, but not necessarily like there's no relationship involved?
It depends. You need to be prepared for both, because the wave, the lineups, this is what's the term that's, the places where you catch the waves, they tend to be pretty crowded because there's limited resources and there's lots of people who surf. So if you're not ready to surf with some buddies or at least some acquaintances, then you're going to be disappointed. But to answer your question, yes, I've had some of my closest friends are people that I've surfed with. And even though it's not like we're riding a bicycle built for two, we're out there sharing the same experience. And it's one of those 1 + 1 = 3 moments where even if I didn't catch that particular wave, there's a joy in watching your good friend catch that particular wave that somehow you internalize that and you kind of were along for the ride anyway.
I mean, I guess there's other experiences like this too, where you see that, but then the ride home or the walk back to the car is where that relationship connection happens. He's like, dude, I saw that thing 20 minutes ago that you caught, or I saw that crazy wipeout that you did, right? And so like, that's where the connection happens, maybe beyond the event, but there's something different from you seeing it happen or, being there to see the elements, then coming home and he calls you on the phone and he's like, dude, you're not going to believe what just happened.
Well, there's a lot of times surfing is like 99% floating around and 1% actually catching the wave. And so a lot of times you just sit next to your friend and you'll say, hey, do you want to go on this one or should I go to the right and you go to the left? So you can kind of see it as it unfolds. And then sometimes, I'll get out of the water before someone and then 2 hours later, he'll send me a photo or a video of it that says, hey, here you go. And you look at it like, yeah, that was a nice wave. Thank you for sending me that.
Did you know approximately 3.5 million people participate in surfing across the United States as of 2023, making it one of the fastest growing board sports in the country? No surprise, California actually leads the nation with about 1.1 million active surfers, followed closely by Hawaii, Florida, and the Carolinas as the most popular states for surfing in the U.S. The average age of American surfers has increased to 34 years old, reflecting the growing number of people who continue surfing well into their adulthood and middle age. All right. So today we're talking to Eric Price on the topic of surfing. Eric, we want to welcome you into the StreetClothes podcast today to open up. It's funny. I think one of the first conversations we had, like the idea and the concept of surfing came up, and it might have been like a quick number two to the fact that you also play the guitar. And, we're recording this episode after episode 2 has come out of the StreetClothes series, where we talked to Kevin Brown about playing the guitar as well. But yeah, we're really excited to have you on the show today to share your passion and experience on the topic of surfing with us.
Well, Hank and Aaron, it is a pleasure. I'm happy to discuss one of my all-time favorite topics. So fire away.
So let's start. We all kind of have a concept of what surfing is, and that may not be true to the reality. I'm trying to think. Like, there's plenty of cartoons. I mentioned Moana. It's got some water involved. There's not a lot of surfing involved with that, right? But that's kind of the Hawaiian culture water thing going. But yeah, there's kind of this, you've never been on a board perception of what surfing is. And then there's, you actually live it and you love it. Could you connect the dots maybe between those two groups of people and explain to us baseline, entry level, how you would explain what surfing really is and what it means?
Well, I think it means a lot of different things to different people. But at the core, it's one of those things where you think about it all the time. You're always watching the surf forecast. You're always communicating with your friends about, hey, are you available Tuesday or whatever it might be? And then you get super excited if something's coming, or super disappointed if you missed it. And then when you're involved in it, you can kind of put aside all the things that might be on your mind from work or life or the rat race. And then you just go out there and you connect with whatever it is you went to connect with, if you're lucky. You get out of the water and feel like a little aqua therapy. So that's, for me at least, that's what it's all about.
So you mentioned the surf, you could call it surf forecast. Is that like on the Weather Channel, like a part of it that I've just never seen before? Or like, I don't necessarily live by the coast, so maybe they just don't give surf forecasts in College Station, Texas. But yeah, what is that?
Well, surf forecasting has become a real science. A website called Surfline, and many that have evolved around the whole science of watching wind, weather. And the origin story of Surfline is kind of incredible. The person who started it used to sit on his roof in California and watch the waves come in, and then do some math and look at the forecast or the weather that happened, in Africa or whatever, and then say, hey, this is where these swells are coming from. And then he started to realize how you can predict when the waves would come. And it started as a phone call, Surfline. You'd call in and you'd get your surf forecast for the local Southern California breaks. And then all of a sudden it became, he was the guy who started to figure out how to predict the waves. And many other people figured out what he was doing. And long story short, as they say, there is an entire science and industry surrounding the forecasting of waves. That's a byproduct of forecasting the weather because it's tied together. So I'll go on a website. One of my favorites is called Surf Captain, and I just boom, go on, look at my local break, and I see if it's going to be good in the morning or bad in the afternoon or whatever this scenario is. And you can forecast once you've started to figure out what the variables are, because there's a lot of moving parts. You can forecast for yourself and decide whether you think that they're lying or they're accurate. But as a beginner, yes, you can just go on, get your forecast, and decide if you're going to.
In the early days of the Surfline, do you think there's any drugs involved on that rooftop out in Southern California?
Pretty decent check. Maybe.
So you mentioned a little bit, we'll probably get into some of this a little bit more, but you mentioned your buddies. Is surfing, so, getting into something like this, getting bitten by the bug, like, do you bring your friends with you? Like people who just maybe like you knew through work or through other hobbies, and you're like, hey, let's all go figure out how to surf together? Is this one of the things that you kind of decide, I want to do this, and then you go out there to where the waves are, which means that's where the other surfers are, and then that's how you begin to build that network of other buddies that also surf, friends, that also surf? So does it happen either way? Like, what was your kind of story? Like, did you bring your friends with you? Did you make friends out there?
More of the second one.
Okay.
After a while, you start to see the same faces over and over. And then if you're lucky, you're considered what's called a regular, or a local is really the proper term. And then if you're a local, there is some strange hierarchy that I don't think I'm anywhere near the top of. But nonetheless, I've gotten the place where I surf regularly. People recognize me, which is a nice feeling, because then you're comfortable, especially if you've unintentionally gotten in someone's way. They're a lot more likely to forgive you than if you are just some random person who showed up and then ruined their perfect wave. But a lot of the friendships that I've gotten have just been striking up a conversation with someone who I've seen a whole bunch of times and said, "Hey man, that was a nice wave." And then next thing you know, you exchange numbers in the, when you're getting out of the water, and you're like, if you want to go next time, text me, because it's always better to have someone you're going with. So you have the buddy system, and it's also more fun sharing waves. But a lot of my good friends have come just from being a little outgoing in the water.
Where everybody knows your name.
Yeah, that's it.
The floating tavern out there off the coast. Yeah. So where do you surf at? Like, where's your primary location?
So I live on Long Island in New York. So my primary break is an old Coast Guard station that used to be a Coast Guard station off of Gilgo Beach.
I didn't know that they had surfing up in New York and on that East Coast, like northern East Coast area.
Yeah, there are a lot of places to surf in New Jersey and New York, and it all is dependent upon the direction of the wind. If you're lucky enough to be able to go from one to the other, then you can score some waves, with more than one set of wind. But for me, I got a short window. So if the wind is offshore and it's north, I go to Gilgo or Long Beach and rock and roll.
Is there a particular demographic, Eric, when you think surfer? And maybe this is a myth busting opportunity, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe the cliches are true. So are they all like 6 foot, blonde, kind of buff, tan guys that are out there surfing with like puka shell necklaces and like board shorts? Or is that just kind of what Hollywood tells us?
It's a little of both. It depends on where you go. So I learned in Southern California, and it was a little bit more like the stereotype was a little more what you described. But like anything else, there's all shapes and sizes. And then when I came to New York and I surfed in New York, it was a lot more of the typical New York accent in the water, which I was so used to the Southern California vibe. And then I got to New York, which is theoretically a little more aggressive demographic. I was like, wow, look at this. There's New Yorkers in the water. But it was just interesting and stereotypes are so obnoxious, but they kind of exist, based on something. And to answer your question, depends where you go. And where I am, there's definitely that vibe, but it's not sunny in summer all the time. So you're in your wetsuit and you realize that not everyone is 6 foot and buff, and some people could lose a little weight, gain a little weight, and the wetsuit doesn't hide anything. So,
which is why you'll probably never see me in a wetsuit there. All right, so let's talk about how you first got into this. Like, was it a friend that you knew that brought you along? Was it just an opportunity, like on a vacation? Talk to us about that first wave you ever caught.
All right, so I worked for 1 year in Southern California, and it was in Laguna Beach, Dana Point, and that was the prototypical surf culture. And I grew up in New Jersey, and we went to the beach pretty regularly, but I never really saw anyone surf and said, oh, wow, let's try that. But then when I got to Southern California, when you like a surfboard, you'd get one like at the age of 3. It was just part of it. You get a bike, you get a skateboard, you get a surfboard. It was so much of part of the fabric of their culture. So I was taking over for someone else, and he was leaving, going to Chicago where there's no ocean, obviously. So he said, hey, man, $100, you're going to have this surfboard. Non-negotiable, it's yours. I said, all right. And so then I found someone to give me a lesson or two. And then I realized, holy cow, I got to do this. And I've always loved the outdoors, mountain biking, hiking. And this was just such a simple, easy thing to say, yeah, I'm all in. So, but in terms of my first wave, I'm sure it was a complete disaster. I took some lessons, and then I was in Southern California. There's pretty much, I don't want to say always, but if you have very low standards for the quality of surf you're willing to ride, you can get in the ocean 5 out of 7 days a week. So like anything else, you have to get up the learning curve. So I would just go every single morning I possibly could before work. Whether the waves were terrible or great, it didn't matter. I just wanted to get more comfortable. And so I don't necessarily remember my first wave, but I remember my first few good waves. And I'll tell you, once I got those, I was like, okay.
Is the feeling adrenaline? Is it like the challenge? Is it the technical skill? Kind of what's driving like you? Like, I know the answer to this is going to be different depending on which surfer you're talking to, right? But for you personally, like, what is it about those early waves and now these many years later that you're still surfing? Like, what are you continuing to chase wave after wave?
It's strange because there's the white water, the wave breaks, and then it just pushes in a bunch of white foam that has enough energy to get you to hydroplane. And then the board starts to take off and you stand and you can balance and ride it. So that's like what a beginner will do. They'll just ride the white water. But then once you've sorted out the mechanics of popping up and balancing, then you go to where the waves are breaking, and you catch them before they actually turn into white water. And then you can kind of come down the face of the wave. And there is a moment where you see the little bump on the horizon and you say, okay, something's coming. And then you paddle over to where you think it's going to take off, or you're going to be able to take off. And if you're lucky, you've got the right spot. And then you paddle to try and match the speed of the breaking wave. And then once you've done that and you start to hydroplane and glide, there is something magical. It's like the hand of God picks you up and just delivers you down the face of the wave. And you just pop up and glide. And it's like if I could plug my finger into the energy of the cosmos, you'd be mainlining it. And you're like, time stops. And there's not a lot of other ways to get that feeling that are healthy. And so that is a massively addictive feeling that I don't think I'll ever stop chasing. But that's the reason that I keep going for it.
Yeah, there's a philosopher out not too far from you at Boston College named Peter Kreeft, who has talked a little bit about the philosophy of the ocean and the power of the ocean. And that's kind of how he described it, right? Like, how can this massive thing, this body of water, just the sound at which can calm you, but then also, to your point, the power, the amazing power, and beyond just the water, the life in the ocean, like the whale story that we told earlier, too, that pops up every now and then to remind you you're not alone in this massive thing and you can't control it. Obviously, that's part of the excitement probably too, that it's not like surfing at the water park, right? Like where you just turn on the water and you get on your boogie board thing and then you do it for 10 minutes until it's the next guy's turn, right? Like you're timing, you're hoping, you're giving it a shot, and many times you're missing your shot, and that's what makes it that much better, right? When you get it the next time. Talk through that average or the typical day. I guess there's not an average day, but we started a little bit earlier talking about the surf line and the surf forecast. That's kind of number one, right? Is it even worth going out today, I guess, is your first consideration. And if it is, what does the day look like from that point on?
So typically I'll keep an eye on the forecast and watch it for 5 to 7 days beforehand. And then as the night before approaches, there's always this stuff there's some excitement surrounding, packing your gear. It's like mission to Mars. I got to get all my stuff ready. But the morning of, the wind is one of the major determinants of whether or not you're going to have good conditions. And the wind is calmest in the mornings and the evenings. And so I usually go at first light, and first light can be, 5 a.m. sometimes. And so I'll get up sometimes, 4:15 in the morning, put on my wetsuit, and have my coffee and drive over to the break, get in the water the minute, you can see, and then surf until I either exhausted or I have to go to work or come home. Half the time I'll just go straight to work because, it's not like I need to wash my hair. I just dump some water over my head and then change into my work outfit and off I go. Take off my wetsuit and change and run. So a typical day will be, squeezing every last minute of time in the ocean. And the beauty of it is I get to see the sunrise. It's typically, there's obviously plenty of other hardcore people out there who are going to arrive early, but many times I'll be leaving while many people are arriving. And it was nice to just get it kind of quiet and calm.
So you mentioned earlier that in Southern California, you could go 5 out of 7 days a week. How often do you get to go in New York, where the weather's a little bit different?
It's very variable. When you have hurricane season, you get a lot more activity. So you can go pretty regularly then. And then in the winter, you get these nor'easters, so you can go then. In the summer, it tends to be a lot of high pressure systems, and high pressure doesn't produce waves. So a lot of times you'll be sitting around or riding very small waves, which are still fun. I got no issue with, I understand that sometimes it's slim pickings and you have to widen your boundaries for what you're, willing to enjoy, but it's not nearly as predictable. There'll be some times where you don't go surf for 6 weeks. And then there's other times when I'm lucky enough to go like 4 days in a certain week. And it's all dependent upon whatever storm is happening offshore.
Let's talk costs here, Eric. One of the visions for these kinds of conversations is, introducing other clinicians to creative hobbies or side hustles or passions that folks get into. But the question is always, okay, let's say I'm kind of convinced I'd love to ride the hand of God as you described it. What's that going to cost me to get into surfing?
Well, it depends on how fancy you want to get. Let's start that way. An entry-level surfboard you can get for maybe $100, $150. We were discussing, the sizes of boards and so forth, and how a board is very good for a new surfer and how it's accommodating and so forth. And there are these really very good quality boards you can get for like $100, $150. They're called Wave Storms. I've got them for my kids. They're forgiving. They're foam on top, so that if you fall on it, it's got a little give instead of, more of a solid board, the traditional boards. So for that, you can go and get one on Amazon for $150 and you're off and running. And then if you're lucky enough to do it in the summer, you just need board shorts and a rash guard and some wax. And then you're, probably a good idea to pay someone for some lessons. But once you're advanced or, you've gotten what you need out of that learner board, you can spend $1,000, $1,200 on a new board if you wanted to. But like anything else, Craigslist, you can get a lot of good stuff for not as much and then get going.
You mentioned wax. What is wax for?
The surface of the surfboard is slippery, so wax is for grip and traction. So when you pop up, you don't want to slide all over the place. And so you wax the board, and now you have a sticky surface, so you're stable and locked in.
That's funny. I always thought it was waxing the bottom of the board, and here I am not knowing what the heck I'm talking about.
It also, the wax smells amazing. There's one called Sticky Bumps there's all kinds of brands, but the one that I use is called Sticky Bumps, and it smells like blueberries. That's the one that I learned on when I was, 20 years ago. And that's the brand I've stuck with. And whenever I smell that smell for like 2 seconds, I'm just like in a magical place. Like, it's crazy how it imprints on your brain.
Yeah. So are there any of those board waxes that are like shark deterrent smells? I don't know what sharks think about blueberries, but
sharks don't like blueberries, and I'm fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nothing smells like seals or like dying fish or anything that you're putting on your board, I guess.
There's like a tuna flavored wax, but
So let's talk about the risk part of it. Obviously the number one thing that, most like just normal folks think about if you're like, okay, yeah, you're surfing out there in the water. What about the risk for sharks and shark attacks? Talk us through how you deal with that risk, but also there's probably other risk that maybe are much more common that folks should just consider before they get out on the board?
Well, the shark, the shark risk is always in the back of your head simply because you're in someone else's neighborhood, and they're the ocean patrol, and they're the likelihood of you meeting up with one is incredibly low, but it's never zero. So it's kind of in the back of your head. And where I live in New York, the water's gotten cleaner and a little bit warmer. So there's been more shark sightings, in the last decade than there were in the previous decades. And they, of course, make the news. And so you get a little nervous and then you decide what you're going to do. I happen to wear this little fancy gizmo on my ankle that's a magnet that's supposed to deter the sonar center in the shark's brain, because that's how they apparently they'll track you, and a magnet will interrupt it. So that makes me at least feel better that I'm doing something. But the most common risk is injury from another surfer or your board, because once that thing goes over the falls, it becomes like a weapon. And there was one morning, it was beautiful, perfect conditions, reasonable size waves, perfect wind. I went and I got a few waves, and then I just took off on the wrong wave. And next thing you know, I'm kind of tumbling over the falls, and my board is tumbling over the falls at the same time. And I feel something hit me in the head, and I pop up and I'm like, all right, I got hit in the head. But then I put my hand on my head and it was full of blood. And I was like, this is bad. And I cared less about the bleeding than the fact that the waves were so perfect, and I had to get out. But I went to work and, I found some medical care, and that was that. But the most dangerous thing in the water is probably your board or someone else's board crashing in.
Is that the primary injury, or the risk for injury would be trauma to the head, or even getting knocked out, I guess, and then some kind of drowning risk as well?
Yeah, that's definitely, there's been stories about that I've heard, these tragic events where I was lucky it hit me in the head and I got some stitches. If it hit me in the head harder and I got knocked out, then that's a whole different game. And I'm sadly aware of those things having happened.
Well, let's flip into some better memories here. Maybe your favorite memory of surfing that you can share with us today.
Well, so I have 4 children, and any time that I've been in the water with them, it's been magical. My daughter is almost 20, and I remember when she was maybe, 5 or 7, or I would put her on a foam board and I'd kind of give her a push, and then I'd pray that she got to the sand okay. And then there was a time when we were in Hawaii for a family trip, and I was with my 16-year-old, and he and I, it was just the two of us that time. And I went and caught a wave, and it was fun. And I got, I finished the wave and I paddled back out, and I was like, all right, I'm going to go back and get some more. And then I see someone coming down the line, and I was like, oh, got to get out of the way of this person. I look up and it's my son. I was like, it's incredible. It's just unbelievable. There was another time on that same trip when I was with 2 of my sons. It was getting dark, and I was like, we got to get out of here. We're like a quarter mile from the sand. We got a 20-minute paddle, and it's getting dark, and sharks like dark. So we got to get out of here. And so my older son says, no, I got to get another wave. I'm not leaving. Oh, well, we have to go. And then all of a sudden, like Poseidon himself just delivered a perfect wave. And my 2 boys just grabbed. The younger one screams out, party wave, which means everyone's going, which is kind of like the opposite etiquette. You're supposed to have like wave, but he's like party wave, and they go. And I was like, holy crap, there we go. And then, I don't know, the times that I've been in the water with my kids and my 10-year-old, we went to Costa Rica, and he caught his first few waves, and he was like, when are we going again?
That's great. So all your kids surf?
Well, not necessarily. They've all tried it.
Okay. Yeah.
But their schedules are very busy. So it's hard to get it all to line up well. But when it does, it's magic.
So, talking about memories, what is the best wave that you've ever caught, and where was it?
Oof. I don't know. there was one time when I went out. So hurricanes produce real hardcore waves that sometimes you should just skip because they're too big. You don't go in during the hurricane. You go in when the passes and the wind and the water have all become organized. There was one time kind of first learning how to surf, and I was back in New York, and there was some large hurricane swell, and I was struggling to get out past the whitewater because there's so much waves coming in, and you just get, every time you get pushed back closer and closer and closer to shore. And I finally made it out beyond the whitewater, and some enormous beast showed up, and I paddled and I went, and it just was like a freight train. And I was like, holy cow, this was just so much power and so much energy. And I made it. And then I was like, I got to do that again. Tried to get another one. And I must have done something wrong on the takeoff. And I just skipped like a stone across the surface, just bounced. And I was like, I think it's time to get out. But that first wave, you can replay them in your head over and over, even if it was 20 years ago. I just remember there was a certain situation where I got to the bottom, and then I glide back up to the top, and then I get back to the bottom, and I get back to the top, and then I turn back, and then I see my friend waving to me, and he's like hooting. I can't believe I'm doing this.
So, Eric, we ask every guest this about their hobby or their side hustle. If surfing could pay the bills, is this something that you would quit your day job and do full time?
So that's a tough question, because when what you're doing for fun and as an outlet becomes something you're doing for work, the pressure has changed. Now my pressure is, how am I going to find time to do this and squeeze it in among my obligations? But I'm paying the bills. And the pressure is self-imposed. Man, I got to get in better shape so I'm not sucking wind when I'm trying to get out there, or I have to work on my form. Then the pressure changes to, I got to go and perform well so that I can get sponsored and travel all over the place and so on. So the surfing lifestyle, as romanticized and perfect as it might seem, it's a bit of a grind. And I'd hate to turn something that I love like this into a grind, because it takes some of the purity out of it for me. But if you said, here's the same paycheck, now go surf, I say fine. Because then I wouldn't have to worry. I'd be all right, fine. This is cool. Let's do it.
Good. Okay. Believe it or not, nearly 40% of active American surfers have a college degree or higher education, challenging that old stereotype of surfers as uneducated beach bums. The average American surfer spends about 108 hours per year in the water, which translates to roughly 2 hours per session once a week. Believe it or not, the Great Lakes region of the U.S. has seen a 29% increase in freshwater surfing participation in just the last 5 years, with Lake Michigan being the most popular for surfing. Well, speaking of paycheck in your day job, obviously you do work besides surfing, and you work in the clinical environment. So we've held off the entire episode as usual. What is it that you do when you're not out there catching the biggest wave you can?
I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I do sports medicine. I fix shoulder and knee problems in the operating room. I've also developed a training app called OR Ninja to help people who are onboarding, whether they are a sales rep or a scrub tech or an SPD tech or a resident, learn about surgical instrumentation and surgical workflow.
And if there's anybody that's curious about that OR Ninja piece, we did interview Dr. Price a couple seasons ago on the Beyond Clean podcast. So just look up the gamification episode. Really interesting conversation, Doc. So let's connect the dots here. If there are dots to connect, some folks like to keep it separate and say there's nothing in common and that's why I do it. But do you feel like your passion and experience that you've been sharing on this episode about surfing, does it have anything to do with being an orthopedic surgeon or, with creating this gamification innovation that you're working on with OR Ninja?
There is an enormous amount of overlap because at some point, if you're a surfer, you're going to get into a situation where you're starting to wonder, why am I here in this ocean? Because maybe the waves are bigger than you thought, or maybe you just took a bad wipeout, or maybe you almost drowned. And if you can't stay calm in those situations, then you'll drown. There's no doubt about it, because that's it. Once you're under the water and you get anxious, you consume more oxygen, and then game over. And especially in the early part of my career as a surgeon, there were many times during those cases when I was operating where I thought, okay, I need to stay calm. And it's not like just calm in an argument. It's calm with someone's life on your OR table. You have to stay focused and deal with whatever's in front of you without decompensating. And when I was training in my fellowship, I mentioned I was in Southern California and I had an incredible mentor. His name is Wesley Nottage. And we used to call the fellowship the Surf and Scope Fellowship. And it was really a parallel because I learned to surf when I was 30. And, there's a learning curve that you have to ascend. And the skills that he was teaching me, I had the basics, but I still had to ascend to the next level. So the challenges that I felt in the ocean of like persevering and being willing to overcome, the fundamentals under my belt and so on, they paralleled getting to be able to do more and more in the operating room. So I would say it's the same journey, just your parallel universe.
I imagine the bigness and the power of the ocean again in that clinical environment. You're just reminded again and again, you cannot challenge and overcome the human body in the way that, you may think, right? Like get all the degrees, get all the training, get all the experience, but there's always going to be something that you didn't know, you didn't expect. The body, to the patient or the device did something that was different this one time. And now you're left there making those decisions, right? The same way that you're making the decision as this new wave comes with a different speed, different cause, hurricane, force winds, whatever it is. And now you're left trying to hop up and stay on. And I think that's a great parallel that you share there, Doc. I'm guessing that there's probably going to be other surfers out there in healthcare that are tuning into this episode that may have some questions, or they may even have a good next location for you to go to, Doc. Or there may be some folks that have been like, you know what? I am in Southern California or I'm somewhere in the Carolinas and I see the waves, I see the surfers, but I've never really pulled the trigger to get into it. What's the best way? How would you want folks to reach out to you if they have questions or comments about this episode?
Well, there's three. You can call me or text me. So my phone number is 516-306-6061. You can email me, Dr. Price at orninja.com, Price at orninja.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to make new friends on LinkedIn as well.
All right. Well, Dr. Price, really appreciate your time. It's been a long time coming. I knew the moment I met you and I found out you're a surfer, I was like, I'm going to have to get you on the StreetClothes podcast. But it's been a couple of months, and then we finally got schedules aligned and we're able to make it happen. But it's a great conversation today. Great story, great inspiration, for anybody out there that's looking to plug into some energy that's bigger than yourself. I think that was a big takeaway I had today.
Well, Hank, it is always a pleasure to be in conversation with you and Aaron. I'm glad that you joined because you could probably have this podcast for 6 hours and I don't think I'd run out of stuff to talk about. So thank you for having me on.
That was Dr. Eric Price, an orthopedic surgeon in the New York area, sharing his passion for the ocean. and more specifically, riding its waves, surfing. Thanks for listening to this episode of Street Clothes, where we explore the lives of clinicians outside of the hospital. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out with an interest that maybe you have taken up outside your department. That's a wrap for this episode of Street Clothes, proudly brought to you by the Healthcare HQ Network. Now, get back to what moves you, because life happens outside of scrubs.